Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all of my awesome English 122 folks. I hope you're well. For today's lesson, we are going to explore techniques for writing with quotes. First, this lesson will look at global or big picture topics such as selecting good evidence, or how you're going to situate and build your paragraph with the evidence inside of it. And then we'll look at more local or fine-tuned details at the sentence level for how we're actually going to compose the sentences themselves. This lesson builds upon your reading notes from They Say, I Say, Chapter 3, as he himself puts it, the art of quoting. So if you don't feel ready to jump into this lesson, you might wish to quickly review your notes from your reading. But if you're ready to jump in, let's go ahead and begin. As always, please do remember to take notes. At the very minimum, it will be helpful to note down the heading of each slide and then the key terms or the key advice. You might want to try out tips notes. You might remember from our note-taking lesson that the topic, obviously for this one, it's going to be writing with quotes. But then again, the main idea might be something that you leave blank for now, and then you come back to it at the end. And then for the bullet points, you might put down section headers for the titles of the slides, and then bullet points for each kind of piece of advice that falls within that area. So if you're ready to begin, let's get started looking at choosing and using evidence. So before we look at the sentence level, let's look at the larger context of how we will choose evidence and how we will discuss the evidence inside of our paragraphs. So firstly, evidence needs to be supportive. Supportive evidence can be multiple different types. Summary, paraphrase, and quotation are all forms of supportive evidence that you might use. But for it to really be supportive, it needs to be relevant to your focused topic. It needs to be relevant to the idea you're introducing and the topic that you are discussing. So you need to have, if you want to go with the structure of our course textbook, you want to start with I say this idea. And then when you're ready to introduce evidence, you're going to be saying, they say something related to my topic that I'm talking about. If we also remember from our course textbook reading, our topic and our idea and our stance will change as we explore through the reading, research, and writing process. So it's always good to double check your evidence each time you revise and make sure that the evidence is still relevant to the topic that you want to talk about. Next, in order for evidence to be supportive, it does need to be direct evidence. Direct evidence will express this source author's stance, opinion, viewpoints, arguments, advice, warnings, etc. Direct evidence is the author's ideas, not your ideas. Not when the author is summarizing somebody else's ideas, not when the author is providing background context. Direct evidence needs to clearly and fairly be expressed through that author's ideas and their viewpoints. So in order to integrate that supporting evidence, in order for the evidence to really show how it supports your topic, you should never assume that the meaning and the significance of that evidence is clear to the reader. For example, we never want to leave the meaning as how the textbook uses those metaphors as an orphan. We never want to leave the evidence as a hit and run quote. So in order for evidence to be supportive, it must be integrated into your own ideas, your own discussion, so that you clearly talk about the meaning and the significance, so your reader knows why you are including those quotations. So check your notes, see if you've written down a few key ideas for how to choose supportive evidence. And then when you're ready to move on, we will look more closely at integrating evidence. Remember that the purpose of adding quotations into your work is to provide context for the topic and discussion that you're talking about. So you want to show what others have been saying. So you want to say, I'm going to talk about this topic, but I'm not talking about it alone. I'm not making this up. I wasn't the first person to think of this. In fact, I'm jumping into a body of ideas that is already in play, already flowing throughout the research conversation, so to speak. Also, when you integrate your evidence, you want to create a balance between those circulating ideas and your own evaluations and responses. So in order to fully integrate your evidence, you want to have a balance between what you are saying and what they are saying. And that's when explaining the meaning and explaining the importance of your evidence really comes into play. It's creating a dialogue, a speaking back and forth between you and the works that you're quoting from. In order to make sure that you are creating that balance, it's always good practice to begin every paragraph with the topic sentence with some ideas about what you think about this topic or why you've chosen to speak about this topic. Similarly, it's always good to end each paragraph with some context about how this topic connects to your thesis, how this topic connects to a larger importance, maybe to a different context, maybe to a different audience, etc. So it's always good to frame the evidence inside a kind of bookends of your own context, your own voice. And that's where topic sentences and those connections to the thesis or those follow-up commentaries will come in. And then finally, always make sure that in this balanced conversation between your views and the research, that you're always fully explaining the meaning and fully explaining the relevance of your ideas. Another way to think about this, in our past English experiences, we might have heard of the term of unpacking a quote. And that's just a metaphor for digging in and like laying out the meaning, laying out the relevance. How is this quote connected to your topic, etc., so that your reader isn't left feeling confused. So take a minute to look at your notes, look and see if you've written down a few details for integrating or unpacking your evidence, and then also take a moment to see if you need to share questions about some of these key ideas. When you're ready, let's take a look at some steps to integrate your evidence. There are 6 key steps to move through. So we'll start with first providing some context. So you would like to introduce the source, maybe tell us where the source is coming from. At the very least, tell us the author and the title of the source. It might be helpful to point out if this was a video, if this was a magazine article, a newspaper article, a scholarly essay. It might be helpful to point out the perspective. So maybe this is an article in favor of something, or maybe this is a video attacking something. So give a little bit of context, at least the title and the author. Next, embed your quote into an embedding phrase. So this would be, you could recall from the textbook, these would be templates for introducing your quotations so that you don't become a hit and run quoter, usually followed by a comma. And then next you will want to paraphrase the meaning. This is where you clearly restate the direct, obvious surface level of the quote that you've given, so that your reader and you both have the same understanding of what this means. This is the as he himself puts it part, where we explain the meaning of a quote. Next, we want to dig in deeper to interpret the quote. So this part of the lesson goes beyond what was introduced in the textbook. When you're fully integrating evidence, you want to explain the meaning of key words, maybe the connotations if they have used a phrase that might have two meanings or a hidden meaning. Maybe you've used a quote that has a metaphor and you want to unpack what is being compared or what imagery is being used. You might want to unpack the logical structures. So if this is a compare and contrast idea, you might want to talk a little bit about both sides that is being brought up in the quote. Or if there are some rhetorical impacts, like if this quote is using certain features to really impact the audience's emotions, maybe to spark fear or anxiety, maybe to spark hope and optimism, or maybe you want to point out that this quote is using appeals to reasoning, logic, facts, statistics. Maybe you want to talk about the values or ethics that are being appealed to here. So if you have a deep quote, you do need to explain key words. Afterward, it will be time to analyze your quotation. This is where you're moving from they say, so you're moving from explaining the quote out back into your I say. You're moving toward independent thinking. These are going to be views that you're coming up with on your own. So one way to do this is to infer about underlying assumptions, underlying values, underlying beliefs. So you can use phrases like, it seems like, this suggests, this quote hints toward, things like that. You can also suggest extended implications or consequences or impacts of the idea that you've used as your evidence. So this could be things like this would lead to, this would cause. You're using independent thinking to stretch the meaning of that quote based on your topic, based on your knowledge and assumptions. You're putting your spin on it in a way that connects it back more clearly to the topic that you're thinking about, that connects it beyond just this one context to think about the larger significance, the larger impact in other areas of culture or for other audiences. And then finally, afterward, you'll be ready to respond to the source. So at this time, you can agree, you can extend, follow up with like, what else, what's next. You can qualify the quote saying something like, I agree that this is true for the most part, but in this circumstance, we have to think of it differently. So this might help you transition toward your next topic. This might help you transition toward connecting with your overall perspective, your overall thesis, etc. All in all, you can think of this integrating, this unpacking, this process is a way of showing your work for why you think this evidence is supportive, why you think this evidence is relevant to your topic and your claims. So take a look at your notes, make sure that you've written down all 6 of these steps, maybe a key instruction for how you feel like you can accomplish one of these steps. And then let's look at some examples for how you can build a paragraph that includes supporting evidence. So before we look at the example, let's remember that a paragraph should begin with a topic sentence. It should begin with your voice telling a little bit about the topic you're about to begin. And then you will integrate the evidence. So when we look at the example, you'll imagine that you've already written your topic sentence, and now you're ready to talk about some evidence. So you'll begin with some context. For our example, we chose, somewhat of a English class related source. So I will introduce the source. The MLA Handbook, now in its 9th edition since first appearing in 1977, is a crucial tool for college writers. So I introduced the title of the source and kind of how long it's been around and what it is. It's a tool. Next, I'll embed a quotation. So we might remember from our templates for introducing a quote from our course reading. So I will say something like, the iconic College English textbook reminds us that not only direct quotations and paraphrases, but also information and ideas must be properly cited. So I've blended the quotation into my own words. So this is something that came up in our textbook. We don't want to be kind of awkward with our quotes. We don't want to say something like, the English textbook quotes that, and then say a quote. We want to smoothly splice it into our own sentence. And next we want to paraphrase. So we want to explain the direct meaning. In other words, even if we are not directly quoting, we should cite the source anytime it influences our own work. Next, we will want to interpret. So this is digging further than the course textbook, where we talk about key words, key ideas. When the MLA advises us to cite the ideas we find in research, it means we should tell which authors have discussed the same topic we are writing about, even if we do not directly quote them. So you can see the interpretation is keying into that one word, ideas, and then expanding upon it to increase the meaning and increase the understanding. Next, we have analyze. So this is using independent thinking to connect with the source, to look at maybe where it's coming from, or to look at maybe how it will impact the context and the situation. So I might say something like, citing all the sources we consult helps us see that a lot of authors are discussing the topic, and it helps us see how our viewpoints fit into the dialogue. So I'm just saying the consequences or the impacts of what this quote is talking about. And finally, we will want to respond. Remember to connect it back to our significance, finishing out the paragraph with our voice. We've made it all the way from I say at the topic sentence, they say in the middle, and now we're ending strongly with an I say again. As a beginning writer, so that's another way of saying from my perspective, it seems like keeping a research list for every project is a lot of extra work, but it also seems like a valuable habit. So if your paragraph is going to move on to something else, you might want to add some type of a transition after this, etc. So remember this example of integrating or unpacking the evidence. This is the middle of the paragraph. This is the bulk of the middle of the paragraph, and you will have a few, a sentence, maybe 2 sentences beforehand and afterwards. So take a look at the example. You don't need to write notes for this example unless you find that to be helpful. But if you have questions, comments, or thoughts, or more clarifications, please use the discussion replies to share. Oh, and remember from the textbook, it asks us, Is it possible to overanalyze a quotation? And yes, it is possible. The depth of unpacking a quote really depends on the complexity of your evidence. So for early writing in the semester, we might only come to paraphrase. Hopefully we push ourselves into interpret, but we might not come all the way to analyze. We might not come all the way to respond as we're still growing and as we're still learning. These are goals, like maximum goals to work toward. And it also depends on the complexity and how interesting our quote is. So keep that in mind as well. So questions, comments, if you need to pause and share. And then let's move on to looking at how we can build sentences with quotes. So this is the more fine-tuned detail. In the previous example, you may have noticed the term embedding. The textbook calls this introducing a quote, but embedding is like a metaphor. It means to smoothly place the quote into your own sentence, to blend it into your own sentence. You can think of it as though you are tucking a quote into a bed of your own words, if that imagery helps you to make the comparison. But all in all, it reminds us that we never want to use a quote as its own sentence. A quote should never stand alone. A quote should never speak for itself. A quote should never be a lonely orphan without any guidance telling the reader how they should treat it or how they should understand it. Next, we will look at some common examples of embedding phrases that help us make the transition from our words to the borrowed words. In this example, Anais Nin tells us we write to taste life twice, in the moment and in retrospect, where tells us is the embedding phrase. Next, we can look at the worst enemy to creativity, Sylvia Plath claims, is self-doubt. So here we have an embedding phrase in the middle of a quote, which is a creative and interesting way to introduce a quote. It's a creative and interesting way. If you have quotes that are coming from, different parts of the page, or you want to skip some in the middle, you can put your embedding phrase here. Next, we have Margaret Atwood describes power as a word after a word after a word. So this is a good example of making sure that we use clear, precise, and descriptive embedding phrases. So we're saying that she describes it, and we're saying what the topic is. And finally, the first draft of anything is shit, declares Ernest Hemingway. This is kind of a callback from our early days of the writing process. So all in all, we just want to remember that using phrases like, for example, according to author, or author states, those are the simplest ways to embed your quotations. So if you're feeling not very creative or not very inspired, stick to the basics in order to get the job done and not leave those quotes dangling out there on their own. Similarly, when we talk about blending the evidence into our own words, we might want to skip over or remove irrelevant and distracting details from a quote, and in that case, you use an ellipsis. Here's an example. A full quote would say, as Philip Jose Farmer sees it, imagination is like a muscle. I found out that the more I wrote, the bigger it got, which is a very awkward and uncomfortable sentence. It has the third person talking about somebody and then the first person pronoun. It has present tense verbs and past tense verbs. So instead we can splice it together using ellipsis, saying something like, as Philip Jose Farmer sees it, imagination is like a muscle. The more I wrote, the bigger it got. Still maybe a little awkward, but it demonstrates ellipsis. Next is brackets. So if you want to change or add some words to blend the quote into your own sentence, maybe you want to clarify some type of pronouns, you can use brackets to show the changes that you've made. So in the original, we have a quote that says, Chris Jamie tells us, closed in a room, my imagination becomes the universe, and the rest of the world is missing out. But we can use brackets to smooth that quote out, saying something like, Chris Jamie tells us, closed in a room, his imagination becomes the universe, and the rest of the world is missing out. So we can change the first person pronoun to the third person pronoun. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts about ellipsis and brackets, make sure and share them. Make sure that your notes say a little bit about each of these techniques for how to blend quotations into your own writing. And then finally, we want to look at citation tags. So citation tags is where you finish every quote by tagging the source in parentheses at the end. And we'll look at an example of this in a little bit. It's important to remember that the citation tag goes at the very end of the sentence that includes a quote. So it doesn't go in the middle of the sentence. You don't say something like, on page 25, this author states. Instead, you go to the very end of the sentence with your citation tag, and then after the tag, you put the period. So the citation tag is within the sentence. The period at the end of the sentence closes the citation tag. So let's take a little bit of a look at the differences between different sources. So no matter whether you're citing a web page or a video or an image, you do want to always include a citation tag that includes the author's name and the location in the text if available. So if you're using a printed source, you will pretty much always tag the author's last name and then the page number or the page numbers that quote came from. So maybe it's two authors, you will put both of their names. If it's a corporation, you put the corporation's name. And then your citation tag just looks like this, parentheses, author, space, the number, parentheses, period. Whereas if you're citing a web-based resource, these generally don't have page numbers, so you'll want to use the paragraph number. This can be very tedious because you need to count the paragraphs. It can be a little bit ambiguous because you might not know, does this count as a paragraph? This is just a line. But when it comes down to it, you just do the best you can. You just put in an honest effort and you'll get your reader close. You'll get them close to where this quote came from. So this is almost the same. It's the author, and then we use the abbreviation PAR dot, and then the number of the paragraph. Close the parenthesis and end with a period. Next, we want to talk about if we're using audio sources or video sources. And in that case, we will tag the author's last name. And again, this could be maybe an uploader's name. It could be a corporation's name. And then we want to tag the timestamp where the quote begins. So it's not necessarily to do the entire range, but if it's a long source, we'll start with hour. But for the most part, we'll just start with minute, second. Close the parentheses and place a period. Try and keep it simple. We don't want to add extra letters, extra abbreviations. We don't want to state the title of the source. We don't want extra types of punctuation like commas. So keep it very simple. Author's last name, number, space. Maybe you need to abbreviate the paragraph, something like that. So in the discussion space below, we will have a chance to sample this out. But before we get there, let's take a look at how we can assemble a sentence with quotations. So take notes and follow along. You'll need your embedding phrase. The sentence should always begin with your voice. It should typically, sometimes as we saw before, you can put the embedding phrase in the middle. But your voice should sort of introduce the evidence. An embedding phrase like says, claims, declares, worries, wonders, asks. And then most often you will have a comma. So most embedding phrases are followed by a comma. Sometimes you don't need the comma based on sentence structure, but for the most part it will be a comma. Then you want to open the quotation marks so that it's very clear when the quote begins. You'll want to copy the quote exactly using the same capitalization, the same spelling, the same pronunciation. Everything that you find in the original should be the same. And then when you're done, you want to close the quotation marks so that your reader fully understands that you're done borrowing words. Don't include your punctuation mark here. Instead, add the citation tag. Remember, that's the parentheses with the author's last name, or maybe the corporation or the uploader, maybe two authors, and then the location in the text. And finally, when you've closed your parentheses, you're done with the sentence, then you add your period. So if you have your own quote from one of your research sources, why don't you grab that, get it out in front of you, and take some time to try this on your own. Start with an embedding phrase. You can check out the templates from our course textbook, or you can go based on your own intuition. Usually you'll need a comma. Next, you'll open the quotation marks, copy down a quote, close those quotation marks, no punctuation yet, add a citation tag. Maybe you didn't grab the location when you were taking notes, so you may need to go back and grab the location, whether you need to count the paragraph or check the timestamp. And then finally, give yourself a period so you know you're done. You can pause, you can come back to this later if you want to share, if you want to get feedback, if you want to share a quotation maybe from like a song or from a movie, just something more fun. If you don't have your research in front of you, that's totally fine. And then review your notes, take a look at what you have for embedding phrases, what you have for, how to assemble that quote, how to use ellipses or brackets, where to get the location information. Ask for more clarification, share your own tips or your own experiences with quoting, etc. And now that you're done, you're closing out your lesson session for today, maybe reviewing your notes. See if you can't capture a summary of like the main advice, the main message, the main takeaway from this lesson. Maybe something about why is it useful or important to use quotations in your work. Why is it important to format your quotations correctly? Maybe close out this lesson by reflecting and summarizing a little bit about your overall takeaway. And then I will catch you guys on the next activity, and I'll see you around.